3, 2, 1, and action.
Thank you very much. I'm very pleased to be here on this session on Citizen Engagement Program's learning event, and the session on tools, tactics, and strategies for achieving social accountability. And I'm really sorry not to be there in person. However, I'm sure you're having a very engaging discussion. What I want to do in this presentation is to highlight some current themes that are ongoing in the citizen accountability debate, and present to you what some of the most cutting-edge thinking is around these issues. So the first thing I want to do is to say that there are obviously still evidence gap that exists in our understanding of when social accountability works and when it doesn't work. While practice on the ground is racing ahead, there are millions of dollars being spent on supporting transparency and accountability initiatives throughout the world. The GPSA is spending millions of dollars, the MAVC, there are bilaterals, and in addition, there are lots of grassroots organizations also adopting these approaches and throwing their energies behind such accountability initiatives in Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America. However, there's a need to catch up on understanding what the spending in this area means. What are the impacts? What are the potential for these initiatives to have transformative outcomes? What lessons can be transferred from what works in one context to another? We are now somewhat better at monitoring and evaluation of some of the ongoing work that's underway. There's a lot of great literature, but it's still patchy, and we have a lot of catching up to do. For example, there's some large-scale efforts at assessing impacts. There's the gold standard RCT++ approach. An example of this is a study that's being led by Harvard called Transparency for Accountability. That is Transparency for Development, sorry. That's one example of this, which is trying to understand whether community-led efforts at accountability in health sector work in Indonesia and Tanzania over a period of 5 years. And we're hoping that we get some really interesting results on what exactly intervening in specific contexts might mean. However, given all this evidence and activity in the field, there still are two main issues that remain. The first is that we need a second generation of evidence synthesis that builds from all the ongoing work. We have the early studies that synthesize the evidence that existed, say, around 2012. For example, the work done by Rosie McGee and John Gaventa here at IDS, but also more recently the work of Jonathan Fox, who summarizes the evidence quite nicely. However, since then, there has been a lot of work ongoing, and we need to understand what all that means. But the second and more important aspect of this work is there's a need to understand and move away from accountability tools, such as social audits or community scorecards, what I call widgets, to understanding how accountability might be built by citizens, what I call watching governments, within a long-term political process of engaging with state institutions. So I'm going to focus my presentation on this last issue. How can we move from widgets to a long-term ongoing process of understanding accountability as a political process? I'm going to touch on three current themes that are ongoing. So the first one, as I said, is beyond widgets, looking at what Jonathan Fox has called strategic versus tactical approaches. And what he's arguing is basically that we need to move from what has been so far tactical approaches that use tools to more strategic ones. The second one is to try and understand state responsiveness. What is it, under what conditions do state officials actually respond to accountability demands? What are the drivers of state behavior? And then the third issue that I'm going to touch on is the whole issue of context. We know that context matters, but increasingly thinking is moving away from identifying isolated factors of context to a more adaptive learning approach that focuses away from best practice. So we'll move next to that, from that. Okay, so going to the first issue. What is the problem here? Most accountability work is focused on using specific tools, community monitoring, social audits, community scorecards, etc. However, we know that these tools work in some places but not in others. Citizens engage in some locations and in some social accountability efforts and not in others. What are the reasons behind this? The problem, as some researchers have identified, is the issue is that these are all tactical approaches. They're tools that work in a program or project mode with limited timescales, bounded interventions, and directed to specific sectors. What we argue here, and more thinking in the field is moving towards, is to try and think more strategically. Accountability deficits are interlinked vertically across different levels and horizontally across different spheres. To challenge these kind of accountability structures that exist and are entrenched, those that hold power and prevent pro-accountability efforts, one needs to take a more accountability ecosystem perspective, look at the whole ecosystem, to look at where accountability initiatives are being blocked, by whom, at what level, and what might be the best strategies for addressing these. So the issue is to try and understand the political processes within which these accountability tools, such as community scorecards, etc., are embedded. What the problem is that impact studies often take a snapshot view of interventions, ignoring the larger trajectory of citizen-state interactions within which tools of accountability form only one small part. So for example, taking a famous example, the Uganda community scorecards, which has been shown to be a wide success, the Bjorkman and Swenson study shows. We know that later research suggests that part of the reason for its success was the importance of political will at the very highest levels, and also other reforms within the educational system that fostered the success. So we need to avoid what Jonathan Fox has called squeezing the balloon problem, where we deal with accountability deficits at one level and then just shift the problem to another level where it continues to be entrenched. That's one issue. The other issue which I point out is that the poor make claims to services through ongoing political processes of engagement with state structures involving a range of actions, social accountability actions, but also in engaging with the electoral systems through contentious protests and other kinds of intermediaries. What I'm arguing here is that each of the social accountability tools that one can be using in particular contexts has to be linked to these ongoing processes which citizens are already engaged in, and for this accountability tool to work. Such multi-pronged, multi-level engagement requires building coalitions among the social groups themselves, between different factions, but also between different levels, the local, the regional, and the national, and across the state and society divide. So we move to the next issue, in particular, this coalition building across the state and society divide. Obviously, we need to understand the inner workings of the state. Why is it that state institutions respond in some locations, not in others, at certain points in time, and not in others? We know that state responses vary from positive changes in behavior, policy resources, to indifference, challenging credibility of citizen-led accountability processes, to downright reprisal. They vary across space, level, and time. And moreover, they are iterative. Citizen action is usually in response to an earlier episode of state action, and therefore this is an ongoing process over the long term. Partly the reason for this is that public institutions are not monolithic. We have elected, non-elected officials at different levels in different public agencies, with different understandings of citizens themselves. We need to understand among this range of actors who are the potential allies and where are the potential entry points. Sometimes state responses are inadequate, we know that. We also need to acknowledge that they might be inadequate because of collective action problems within the state, given fragmentation, unclear lines of accountability and authority, and general risk averseness. Public officials within the state face collective action problems the same as citizens do. So what do we need to do? We need to understand power structures, but we also need to understand and unpack individual motivations, incentives, preferences, and discretion, and take a closer look at organizational cultures. How are different, often contradictory pressures being balanced within the state? To what extent are responses that we see a result of conscious action versus sort of subconscious use of standard operating procedures? The second issue is that we need also to look out from within the state to see how state officials look at citizens. How are public officials actually viewing citizen-led claims? Are these viewed as legitimate claims or unreasonable demands? How do claims and potential responses fit within the work conditions of bureaucrats? Are citizens being viewed as potential allies and co-producers, or are they being viewed as problems? Through what processes do perceptions of officials and citizen-led demands change? Can citizen-led accountability processes make citizens more visible to the state? These are important questions that researchers are grappling with at the moment, which have a bearing on whether social accountability works or doesn't work. The third point is, in relation to understanding state responsiveness, is that while most citizen-led accountability experiences trace the visible impacts of citizen-led accountability, in our programs, there is an increasing recognition that we need to name and trace the more invisible impacts, which might be both positive or negatives. And these include changes in perceptions of bureaucrats about the legitimacy of citizen claims, of gendered roles in public spaces, of the efficacy of their own actions, and about cohesion within public agencies. These are the foundations for more enduring shifts in organizational culture that social accountability efforts aim to transform. And finally, I come to the issue that you probably have been discussing earlier this morning, the issue of context. Almost every social accountability study seems to suggest that context matters. So we know context matters. But what are these factors within which context matters? What are these interventions? What these interventions aim to influence and change are complex socio-political relationships and processes. Whether a particular approach will work or not depends on context. And while macro context matters, for example, whether a country is authoritarian or democratic, whether there exists a vibrant civil society or not, whether there is fair and open media or not. It is the micro context that matters. And by micro context, I don't mean at the very local level. I mean the proximate factors that might be operating at the level of intervention that you're initiating. So this is because micro context determines whether the assumptions we make about our approach are right or not. So I'm suggesting that we need to look at this micro context more carefully. In order to do that, people are increasingly taking a causal chain approach. And what does this causal chain, or some people call it theory of change approach, mean? This basically, it means laying out the rationale for why we think our approach will work in a step-by-step fashion, surfacing the assumptions behind each step and checking whether they hold in the context we work in, tracing the path of the intervention as it unfolds. And we'll give you an example from the Lieberman, Posner and Tsai study in Tanzania, which is quite well known, which looked at why is it an information intervention didn't have the intended impact in education. And the reason, as they did a causal chain, which is available in the paper, suggests that the citizens did not even follow 1/3 of the path down this causal chain. So for example, it wasn't that they didn't understand the information, but they just didn't believe that their intervention would make any impact. And so you didn't even go down 1/3 of the way of the causal chain. This is an important, important issue. So then the big leap is to move away from understanding what works in specific contexts, which is of course important, and there are lessons to be learned there, but to understanding how organizations can take from such a causal chain approach to thinking about their social accountability tools and adapt their theory of change as the program unfolds. So here what we are saying is important is understanding the capacity of organizations to learn and adapt rather than to copy strategies that might have worked elsewhere, even though they might have been in a similar context. This has been the recent focus of a Transparency Accountability Initiative workshop in Rio recently, where a lot of organizations were present and thinking about how organizations might move to a more learning mode. It's important to recognize, however, that there's an inherent tension between this kind of approach of adaptive learning and the bureaucratic and projectized nature of donor programs. There is an increasing recognition that there is this tension, and some external funders are trying to address this issue. The current debates are centered around ways of creating processes that work through this tension. So finally, the challenge, and I'm sure you'll discuss this further in your deliberations, is to find ways to foster such adaptive learning within organizations in the context you're in, drawing lessons from other contexts of places and approaches that have worked, but to try and learn more from what's working iteratively within one's own context. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Sorry, don't take that last bit. Edit it out.
I can't edit
Oh.
anything.
Can you